The morning sun peeked through the grand windows of the Winters estate as Rose Thomas carefully dusted the crystal chandelier in the main hallway. At 42, Rose had the kind of quiet strength that came from years of hard work and unwavering determination. For the past 8 years, she had worked as the head housekeeper for one of the richest men in the country, Richard Winters. The sprawling mansion sat on 10 acres of perfectly manicured grounds. Rose knew every corner of it, from the state-of-the-art kitchen where she prepared occasional meals to the hidden storage closets tucked beneath winding staircases. The other staff members came and went during the day, but Rose lived in the small but comfortable apartment above the garage. She was always there, a constant presence in a house that often felt too big and too empty. "Miss Rose," a young voice called out, followed by the sound of running footsteps. Rose smiled, setting down her feather duster as 10-year-old Ethan Winters rounded the corner. His dark hair was sticking up in all directions, his favorite blue robot t-shirt slightly wrinkled despite Rose's careful ironing the day before. "Slow down, little man," Rose said with a warm laugh. "These floors are slippery." Ethan skidded to a halt in front of her, his face flushed with excitement. "Dad said we might go to the Science Museum this weekend if his meeting finishes early. Do you think they still have the space exhibit?" Rose knelt down to his level, gently smoothing his wild hair. "I'm sure they do, and if not, there'll be something even more amazing to see." The truth was, Richard Winters rarely had time for museum trips. As the founder and CEO of Winters Tech, one of the largest technology companies in the world, his calendar was perpetually full. Board meetings, international business trips, and endless conference calls consumed most of his waking hours. Rose had watched for years as Ethan's hopeful face turned to disappointment when his father's assistant would call with the inevitable news that something had come up. "Mrs. Phillips says I need to finish my math before lunch," Ethan said, referring to his private tutor. "But I wanted to show you my new drawing first." He pulled a slightly crumpled paper from his pocket and proudly presented it to Rose. It showed a stick-figure family, a tall man in a suit, a small boy, and a woman with curly hair that Rose recognized as herself. Above them, in childish handwriting, were the words, "My family." Rose felt her heart squeeze in her chest. Since Ethan's mother had died from complications during childbirth, Rose had become the closest thing to a maternal figure in his life. She had been there for his first steps, his first words, had nursed him through fevers and nightmares while his father worked late into the night. "It's beautiful," she said, carefully folding the drawing and tucking it into her uniform pocket. "I'll put it up in my apartment later. Now you better get back to those math problems before Mrs. Phillips comes looking for you." Ethan groaned dramatically but turned to head back to the study. At the doorway, he paused. "Miss Rose, do you think Dad will really make it this weekend?" The hope in his eyes made Rose's chest ache. "I think he'll try his very best," she said, carefully. "Now go on, scoot." As Ethan's footsteps faded down the hallway, Rose returned to her dusting, moving methodically through the living room with its expensive art and furniture that cost more than she would earn in a lifetime. Rose hadn't planned on becoming a housekeeper for the ultra-wealthy. Growing up in a small town in Georgia, she had dreamed of becoming a nurse. But life had other plans. Her mother's illness had forced her to drop out of community college to care for her, and after her mother passed, the bills had piled up. She had found work cleaning houses, discovering she had a talent for bringing order to chaos. One job had led to another, and eventually she had been recommended to Richard Winters, who had been looking for someone trustworthy and discreet to run his household after his wife's passing. The salary had been too good to turn down, especially with Rose's younger sister depending on her help to get through college. Now that sister was a successful physical therapist with 2 children of her own, but Rose had stayed on, unable to leave Ethan, who had become like a son to her. Later that afternoon, while preparing Ethan's favorite after-school snack of apple slices and peanut butter, Rose heard the front door open. Richard Winters rarely came home before dinner, and the unexpected sound made her look up in surprise. Richard walked into the kitchen, his normally perfect appearance slightly disheveled. His tie was loose, and there was a tension around his eyes that Rose had learned to recognize as a sign of extreme stress. "Mr. Winters," she said, wiping her hands on a kitchen towel. "I wasn't expecting you so early. Would you like some coffee?" Richard ran a hand through his graying hair. At 45, he was still a handsome man, with the kind of confidence that came from building a billion-dollar company from the ground up. But today, he looked every bit his age and then some. "No coffee, thanks, Rose." His voice sounded strained. "Is Ethan still with Mrs. Phillips?" "Yes, sir. They should be wrapping up soon. Is everything all right?" Richard hesitated, which was unusual for a man who made split-second decisions worth millions of dollars on a daily basis. "Actually, no. I need to talk to you about something. Important. Is there somewhere we can speak privately?" Rose felt a flutter of anxiety in her stomach. In all her years working for the Winters family, Richard had never asked to speak with her privately, except for her annual performance review. "Of course," she said, gesturing towards the small breakfast nook at the far end of the kitchen. It was far enough away from the main hallway that they wouldn't be overheard. They sat across from each other at the small table, Richard's large frame making the space seem even more intimate than it was. He folded his hands in front of him, his knuckles white with tension. "Rose, I've always valued your discretion and your dedication to this household," he began, his voice low and serious. "What I'm about to tell you cannot leave this room, not yet anyway." Rose nodded, her concern growing by the second. "You know you can trust me, sir." Richard took a deep breath. "It's about Ethan. He had some routine tests last week, and the doctor found something concerning. We've been doing more tests since then, and I just got the final results this morning." His voice cracked slightly. "He has a rare heart condition, something called hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, but with an unusual genetic mutation that's making it progress much faster than it normally would." Rose felt as if the floor had dropped out from under her. Ethan, with his boundless energy and bright smile, had always been the picture of health. "But he seems fine," she whispered more to herself than to Richard. "That's what makes it so dangerous," Richard said, rubbing his temples. "He might seem fine right up until he's not. The doctor said without treatment he could have a sudden cardiac event within months, maybe sooner." "Treatment," Rose repeated, clinging to the word. "There is treatment, right?" Richard's face darkened. "There's an experimental procedure. A team at Boston Children's Hospital has been developing a new type of gene therapy specifically for rare cardiac conditions like Ethan's. The success rate in the trial phase has been promising, but what?" Rose pressed when he didn't continue. "It's not covered by insurance. It's too new, too experimental. And the window for getting him into the program is closing. They only take a limited number of patients, and the next round of treatment starts in 2 weeks. Rose didn't need to ask about the cost. The grim look on Richard's face told her everything. "How much?" $2 million, Richard said, the number hanging heavy in the air between them. Under normal circumstances, that wouldn't be an issue. But the timing couldn't be worse. We're in the middle of the biggest merger in the company's history. Everything I have is tied up in stocks and assets that I can't liquidate right now without tanking the whole deal." Rose's mind was spinning, trying to make sense of it all. How could a man worth billions not be able to access $2 million for his own son? "What about a loan?" she suggested. "I've been working on it all day, but the banks want collateral that isn't already tied to the company, and with the merger negotiations so delicate." He trailed off, looking more defeated than Rose had ever seen him. "I'm heading to Tokyo tomorrow to try to close the deal early. If I can make that happen, I might be able to free up the funds in time." "Does Ethan know?" Rose asked, her heart breaking at the thought of the little boy finding out about his condition. Richard shook his head. "Not yet. I don't want to scare him until we have a plan. Mrs. Phillips has been told he needs to take it easy due to a minor heart murmur, but that's all. I'm counting on you, Rose, to keep a close eye on him while I'm gone. If you notice anything at all that seems off, call the doctor immediately. The number's programmed in all the house phones." "Of course," Rose said without hesitation. "I'll watch over him like he's my own." Richard gave her a tired smile. "You already do, Rose. I don't know what either of us would do without you." As Richard left the kitchen to go find his son, Rose remained seated at the breakfast nook, her mind racing with worry. In that moment, she made a silent promise to Ethan and to herself. She would do anything, anything at all, to keep that boy safe. What she didn't know then was just how far anything would take her, or how that promise would change all their lives forever. 3 days after Richard Winters left for Tokyo, Rose noticed the first warning sign. She was helping Ethan with his breakfast when the boy suddenly put down his spoon and pressed his hand against his chest. "What's wrong, sweetie?" Rose asked, immediately alert. Ethan frowned slightly. "My heart feels funny, like it's doing jumping jacks." Rose felt a chill run through her body. She kept her voice calm, even as her own heart began to race. "How long has it been feeling that way?" "Just now," Ethan said, but then looked thoughtful. "Well, maybe a little bit yesterday too when I was playing video games, but it went away." Rose put her hand on his forehead, which felt cool to the touch. "Why don't we take a little break from breakfast? Maybe lie down for a bit?" "But Mrs. Phillips is coming at 9, Ethan protested weakly. "I'll call and let her know you're taking a sick day," Rose said, already reaching for her phone. "Let's get you comfortable on the couch." As soon as Ethan was settled with a light blanket and his favorite cartoon playing quietly on the TV, Rose stepped into the hallway and called Dr. Reynolds, the heart specialist Richard had mentioned. After explaining Ethan's symptoms, the doctor's response was immediate and concerning. "Bring him to my office right away," Dr. Reynolds said, his voice grave. "Those could be early signs of arrhythmia. Given his condition, we need to monitor him closely." 2 hours later, Rose sat in a sterile waiting room while Ethan underwent tests. She had tried calling Richard 3 times, but with the time difference and his critical negotiations, she had only been able to leave urgent messages with his assistant. When Dr. Reynolds finally emerged from the examination room, his expression made Rose's stomach drop. "The arrhythmia is worse than I expected," he said without preamble. "The walls of his heart are thickening more rapidly than our initial scans indicated. I'm afraid the timeline has accelerated." "Has Mr. Winters made any progress with the treatment program in Boston?" Rose shook her head helplessly. "He's in Tokyo, closing a major business deal. He hoped it would free up the money for the treatment." Dr. Reynolds frowned. "At the rate Ethan's condition is progressing, waiting even a week could be dangerous. The next treatment group at Boston Children's starts in 10 days, and they need payment and paperwork finalized at least a week before that." "That's only 3 days from now," Rose whispered, the reality of the situation hitting her like a physical blow. "I know," the doctor said grimly. "I've prescribed medication that may help manage his symptoms temporarily, but it's not a solution. He needs that gene therapy. I'll try reaching Mr. Winters myself, but you should prepare for the possibility that Ethan may need to be hospitalized if his condition worsens." Rose nodded numbly, trying to process everything. "Can I take him home now?" "Yes, but he needs complete rest. No physical activity whatsoever. And if you notice any more episodes like this morning, bring him back immediately." The drive back to the Winters estate was quiet. Ethan, drowsy from the medication, dozed in the back seat while Rose's mind raced through possible solutions. She had tried Richard's satellite phone again from the doctor's office, but it had gone straight to voicemail. His assistant had promised to get an urgent message to him during the next break in negotiations, but couldn't say when that would be. By evening, Rose had settled Ethan in his bed with strict instructions to call her if he felt strange in any way. She paced the kitchen, checking her phone every few minutes, hoping for word from Richard. Nothing came. At midnight, unable to sleep, Rose made a decision. She needed to understand exactly what they were facing and what options might exist. Using the master key she kept for emergencies, she let herself into Richard's home office. The large room was immaculate, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves on one wall and a massive desk overlooking the gardens. Rose had cleaned this room hundreds of times, but had never gone through Richard's papers. It felt like a violation of his trust, but Ethan's life was at stake. She began with the most recent files on his desk, quickly finding a folder labeled Ethan Medical. Inside were doctor's reports, test results, and several documents about the experimental treatment at Boston Children's Hospital. Rose read through everything, her heart sinking further with each page. The treatment was even more promising than Richard had indicated, with a 78% success rate in similar cases. But the cost was firm, $2 million, with no payment plan. Options. It was considered so experimental that even Richard's premium health insurance wouldn't cover a penny. Deeper in the folder, Rose found correspondence with various financial institutions. Richard had been trying to secure a personal loan, separate from his business holdings, but the responses were all the same. Due to the complex nature of the pending merger and his assets being temporarily frozen as part of the negotiation process, traditional loans weren't possible on such short notice. Rose sat back in Richard's leather chair, feeling the weight of helplessness press down on her. She glanced at a framed photo on the desk, Richard holding a newborn Ethan, his face a mixture of joy and grief following his wife's death. "What would you do?" Rose whispered to the empty room. "If you were here right now, what would you do to save your son?" As if in answer, her eyes fell on Richard's computer. It was password protected, of course, but Rose knew the code. She had seen Richard enter it countless times when she brought coffee to him while he worked. It had always seemed innocent enough she had never intended to use it. But now, her fingers hovered over the keyboard for a long moment before she typed in Catherine 0912, Ethan's mother's name and the date of her death. The screen unlocked, revealing dozens of financial documents. Rose wasn't an expert in high finance, but she knew enough to navigate to Richard's banking information. As his household manager, she already had limited access to certain accounts for running the house and paying staff. But what she found now was different. These were his personal accounts, containing sums of money she could barely comprehend. One account in particular caught her attention. It was labeled Emergency Reserve and contained exactly $5 million. According to the transaction history, it hadn't been touched in over 3 years. It appeared to be completely separate from his business holdings, money that was just sitting there while Ethan's life hung in the balance. Rose stared at the screen, a dangerous idea forming in her mind. If Richard couldn't be reached in time, and if this money wasn't tied up in the merger, she shook her head, trying to clear the thought. What she was considering wasn't just grounds for termination. It was a serious crime. Grand theft. She could go to prison for years. But then she thought of Ethan's small hand pressed against his chest this morning, the doctor's grim expression, the ticking clock. With trembling fingers, Rose navigated to the transfer page. She knew the information for Boston Children's Hospital from the paperwork in the folder. $2 million. One simple transfer. It would take seconds. Her finger hovered over the confirm button. 8 years of loyal service. 8 years of raising Ethan as if he were her own. Would Richard really let his son die because of bad timing and business complications? No, she decided, he wouldn't. He was just trapped in an impossible situation. "I'm sorry, Richard," she whispered. "I'll face the consequences, whatever they may be." She pressed confirm. The screen flashed a confirmation message, and just like that, it was done. $2 million transferred from Richard Winter's emergency fund to Boston Children's Hospital with Ethan's name and case number in the reference line. Rose sat back, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. There would be no going back from this. Even if she could somehow reverse the transfer, which she doubted, the breach of trust would be unforgivable. But Ethan would live. That was what mattered. She carefully closed all the windows on the computer, shut it down, and returned everything in the office to its exact original position. Then she went to her small apartment and made 3 calls. The first was to Boston Children's Hospital, confirming they had received the payment and securing Ethan's place in the treatment program. The second was to Dr. Reynolds, informing him that the financial issues had been resolved and Ethan would be starting treatment next week. The third was to Richard's travel agent, booking 2 first-class tickets to Boston for herself and Ethan, departing the day after tomorrow. She didn't sleep that night. How could she, knowing what she had done? Instead, she sat by her window, watching the moon move across the sky, wondering if she would ever see it from outside a prison yard again. The next morning, Rose went about her duties as if nothing had changed. She made Ethan his favorite breakfast, helped him take his medication, and gently told him they would be taking a trip to Boston for a special doctor who could help his heart feel better. "Is Dad coming too?" Ethan asked, his eyes lighting up despite his tiredness. Rose felt a pang of guilt. "Your dad is still working very hard in Tokyo. He'll meet us there as soon as he can." It wasn't exactly a lie. Once Richard found out what had happened, she was certain he would fly straight to Boston, though whether it would be to support his son or to have her arrested remained to be seen. Throughout the day, Rose continued trying to reach Richard, leaving increasingly urgent messages about Ethan's condition and their travel plans. She didn't mention the money. That conversation needed to happen in person, when she could explain her actions face to face. By evening, she had packed suitcases for both herself and Ethan, arranged for the other household staff to care for the property in their absence, and prepared detailed notes about Ethan's medication schedule and dietary needs. Everything was in order. Everything except the growing knot of fear in her stomach. As she tucked Ethan into bed that night, he looked up at her with trusting eyes. "Miss Rose? Am I going to be okay?" Rose smoothed his hair back from his forehead, fighting back tears. "Yes, sweetheart. The doctors in Boston are the very best, and they're going to make your heart strong again." "Are you scared?" he asked, surprising her with his perception. Rose considered lying, but couldn't bring herself to do it. "A little bit," she admitted. "But being brave doesn't mean you're not scared. It means you do what needs to be done even when you are scared." Ethan nodded solemnly. "Like when I had to get that big shot last year and you held my hand?" "Just like that," Rose said, her voice thick with emotion. "Now get some sleep. We have a big day tomorrow." After Ethan fell asleep, Rose returned to her apartment and sat down to write a letter to Richard. She explained everything: Ethan's worsening condition, the accelerated timeline, her desperate search for solutions, and finally, the terrible choice she had made. She took full responsibility, making it clear that she alone had acted and was prepared to face the consequences. She sealed the letter in an envelope, addressed it to Richard, and placed it on her neatly made bed. Then she packed a small, separate bag with her most essential belongings, the items she would want to have with her if she was taken directly from the hospital to jail. Just as she was zipping the bag closed, her phone rang. Richard's name flashed on the screen. Rose's hand shook as she answered. "Mr. Winters." "Rose." His voice was tight with tension. "I just got your messages. All of them. What's happening with Ethan? Is he all right?" Rose took a deep breath. This was it. "He's stable for now, but his condition has worsened. The doctor says he can't wait for the treatment. I've made arrangements for him to begin at Boston Children's Hospital next week." There was a brief silence. "Arrangements?" Richard asked, his tone suddenly sharp. "What kind of arrangements, Rose?" She closed her eyes, bracing herself. "Sir, I think this is a conversation we should have in person. We're flying to Boston tomorrow. Ethan's place in the treatment program has been secured." "How?" The single word contained a world of suspicion. Rose couldn't lie to him. Not anymore. "I transferred the money from your emergency fund. I know I had no right, and I'm prepared to accept whatever consequences." "You did what?" Richard's voice rose in disbelief. "Rose, I know exactly what it is, Mr. Winters," she interrupted, her voice steadier than she felt. "It's theft. It's a violation of your trust. It's probably the end of my career and my freedom. But Ethan is going to live, and that's all that matters to me." The silence that followed seemed to stretch for an eternity. Rose could hear her own heartbeat in her ears, waiting for the explosion of anger, the threats, the end of everything. Instead, Richard's voice came back soft and strained. "The emergency fund. How did you even know about that?" "I accessed your computer," Rose admitted. "I was desperate to find a solution. Another long pause. "I'll be on the next flight back," Richard said finally. "Don't do anything else until I get there." "Sir," the doctor said. "I heard what you said about the doctors," he cut her off. "But I need to see my son and I need to talk to you in person. Don't leave for Boston until I get there." "That's an order, Rose." The line went dead before she could respond. Rose set her phone down slowly, a cold dread settling in her stomach. She had hoped for understanding, or at least a chance to explain fully before Richard made any decisions. Now, it seemed, she would face the music sooner rather than later. All she could do was wait, and hope that when Richard arrived, his concern for Ethan would outweigh his anger at her betrayal. Richard Winters arrived at the estate 36 hours later, looking as if he hadn't slept in days. His private jet had landed just after dawn, and he had come directly from the airport, still wearing the same suit he'd had on for international negotiations. Rose was waiting for him in the kitchen, a fresh pot of coffee brewing. She had barely slept herself, torn between checking on Ethan throughout the night and rehearsing what she would say when Richard finally confronted her. "Where is he?" were Richard's first words as he dropped his briefcase on the counter. "Still sleeping," Rose said quietly. "The medication makes him drowsy. Dr. Reynolds said that's normal." Richard nodded, his face haggard with worry and jet lag. He poured himself a cup of coffee with movements that seemed mechanical, automatic. Then he turned to face Rose, his eyes hard. "Tell me everything," he said. "From the beginning." For the next 20 minutes, Rose explained in detail how Ethan's condition had suddenly worsened, the urgent warnings from Dr. Reynolds, and her increasingly desperate attempts to reach Richard. She described finding the medical files, accessing his computer, discovering the emergency fund, and making the fateful decision to transfer the money. "I know it was wrong," she finished, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "I know I betrayed your trust in the worst possible way, but Ethan's life was at stake and there was no time." Richard had listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. Now he set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he asked, his voice dangerously calm. Rose straightened her shoulders. "Yes, sir. I stole $2 million from you." "No." Richard shook his head. "You accessed private financial information, used my personal accounts without authorization, and transferred a large sum across state lines." "That's not just theft, Rose. Under federal law, that could be classified as wire fraud or computer fraud. The penalties are severe. We're talking about serious prison time." Rose felt the blood drain from her face, but she kept her chin up. "I understand, sir, and I'm prepared to face those consequences." "Are you?" Richard challenged, his voice rising slightly. "Are you really prepared to go to prison for years? To have a felony record that will follow you for the rest of your life? To never work in a position of trust again?" "If it means Ethan gets the treatment he needs, then yes," Rose said without hesitation. "I made my choice knowing exactly what I was risking." Richard stared at her for a long moment, then abruptly turned away, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "You had no right," he said, his back to her. "No right at all to make that decision." "You're absolutely right," Rose agreed softly. "I had no legal right. But after 8 years of raising that boy alongside you, watching him grow, being there for him when you couldn't be, I felt a moral obligation to do whatever was necessary to save his life." Richard whirled around. "You think I wouldn't have done whatever was necessary? He's my son." "I know you would have," Rose said quickly. "But you weren't here. You couldn't be reached. Time was running out. What would you have done in my position?" The question hung in the air between them, unanswered. Finally, Richard sighed, the anger seeming to drain out of him, replaced by bone-deep weariness. "The treatment program," he said. "You're certain it's arranged? Everything's in place?" Rose nodded. "I confirmed it yesterday. They received the payment. Ethan has a place. They're expecting us tomorrow." Richard pressed his fingertips against his temples as if trying to push back a headache. "All right, we'll go to Boston. Ethan will get his treatment. But after that," he let the implication hang. After that, you'll do what you need to do, Rose finished for him. I understand. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of small feet padding into the kitchen. Ethan appeared in the doorway, his pajamas rumpled, his face lighting up when he saw his father. Dad, you're back! He rushed forward and Richard caught him in a fierce hug, lifting him off his feet. Hey, buddy, Richard said, his voice suddenly gentle. I missed you. Miss Rose said we're going on a trip to see a special doctor, Ethan said, looking up at his father. She said you might meet us there, but you're already here. Richard shot a quick glance at Rose over Ethan's head. That's right. We're all going to Boston together. The doctors there are going to help you feel better. Is something wrong with me? Ethan asked, sudden worry clouding his face. Miss Rose said my heart just needs a little help, but she's been checking on me all night. Richard knelt down to his son's level. You have a condition called hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. It's a long name for a heart that's working too hard. But these doctors have a special treatment that can fix it. Will it hurt? Ethan's voice was small. Some parts might be uncomfortable, Richard said honestly. But Miss Rose and I will be with you the whole time. And when it's over, you'll be able to run and play just like before. Ethan seemed to consider this for a moment, then nodded solemnly. Okay, can I have pancakes for breakfast? The simple request brought a genuine smile to Richard's tired face. Absolutely. Go wash up and I'll get them started. As Ethan scampered off, the tension between Rose and Richard returned. They moved around each other awkwardly in the kitchen, gathering ingredients and cookware, careful not to touch or make eye contact. I've booked the company jet for noon, Richard said as he mixed pancake batter. I'll have my assistant arrange accommodations near the hospital. I've already packed his things, Rose said. His medication, comfortable clothes, his favorite stuffed animal. Richard nodded without looking at her. Good. That's good. The rest of the morning passed in a strained simulacrum of normalcy. They ate breakfast as a family, helped Ethan dress and gather his favorite books for the trip, and loaded their luggage into Richard's waiting car. To an outside observer, they might have looked like any family preparing for a medical journey, concerned but united. Only Rose and Richard knew the truth of what lay beneath the surface. On the private jet to Boston, Ethan fell asleep across 2 seats, exhausted from the medication and the excitement. Richard sat across from Rose, speaking for the first time since they'd left the house. I made some calls, he said quietly, about the merger and the timing. Rose looked up from her book, waiting. The deal was nearly complete, Richard continued. Another day or 2 at most. The funds would have been released and I would have been able to pay for Ethan's treatment without... He trailed off. Without me committing a crime, Rose finished. For him. I'm sorry, Mr. Winters, I truly am. But Ethan didn't have another day or 2. Richard's jaw tightened. That should have been my call to make. You're right, Rose acknowledged. It should have been. But you were unreachable, and I had to make a judgment call with the information I had. And now we both have to live with the consequences, Richard said grimly. When they landed in Boston, a sleek black SUV was waiting to take them directly to the hospital. Richard had made arrangements for Ethan to be admitted immediately, bypassing the usual intake procedures. Money might not have been available for the treatment itself due to the merger complications, but Richard's influence still opened doors. The hospital was a sprawling complex of modern buildings with a dedicated children's wing decorated in cheerful colors. Dr. Isabel Chen, the lead physician for the gene therapy program, met them in a private consultation room. She was a petite woman with a direct gaze and a manner that was both professional and warm. Mr. Winters, she said, shaking Richard's hand. And you must be Ethan. I'm Dr. Chen. I'll be overseeing your treatment. Ethan pressed closer to Rose's side, suddenly shy. Are you going to fix my heart? Dr. Chen smiled. That's the plan. Your heart has a special code that's telling it to grow in a way that makes it work too hard. We're going to use some special medicine to change that code and help your heart work properly. While Dr. Chen explained the treatment process in child-friendly terms, a hospital administrator appeared at the door, gesturing for Richard to step outside. Rose felt a spike of anxiety as Richard followed the administrator into the hallway. Had something gone wrong with the payment? Had Richard already reported what she'd done? Ethan tugged at her hand. "Miss Rose, will you stay with me when they do the treatment?" Rose forced a smile, pushing aside her worries. "Of course, sweetie. I'll be right here." Dr. Chen gave her a sympathetic look. "The first phase begins tomorrow morning. We'll need Ethan to stay overnight for monitoring and preparation. One parent can stay in the room." "I'm not—" Rose began, then stopped herself. In every way that mattered, she had been more of a parent to Ethan than anyone else for the past 8 years. "I'll stay with him." Dr. Chen nodded. "Excellent, I'll have the nurses prepare the room." She turned back to Ethan. "Now, young man, let's get you settled in and run some initial tests." As they followed Dr. Chen down the hallway, Rose caught sight of Richard deep in conversation with the administrator. His face was flushed and he was gesturing emphatically. Whatever they were discussing, it wasn't going well. The next few hours were a blur of activity. Ethan was settled into a private room, underwent a battery of tests, had an IV placed, and was visited by various members of the medical team. Through it all, Rose stayed by his side, answering questions, holding his hand during blood draws, and trying to keep his spirits up. Richard appeared occasionally, speaking with doctors in the hallway, making phone calls and bringing Ethan small gifts from the hospital gift shop. But he barely acknowledged Rose, treating her with a cold professionalism that cut deeper than any angry words could have. By evening, Ethan was exhausted. He fell asleep quickly after dinner, the monitors beside his bed beeping steadily. Rose sat in the recliner next to him, preparing for a long night. Richard stood at the foot of the bed watching his son sleep. "I'll get a hotel nearby," he said quietly. "Call me if anything changes." Rose nodded. "I will." Richard lingered for a moment, seeming on the verge of saying something more. Then he turned and left without another word. Rose dozed fitfully throughout the night, waking at every small noise or change in Ethan's breathing. Nurses came and went, checking vitals and adjusting medications. By morning, she was exhausted but determined not to show it. Richard arrived early, freshly showered and wearing new clothes, a stark contrast to Rose's rumpled appearance after her night in the hospital chair. He brought coffee for both of them, a small gesture that Rose accepted gratefully. "Any changes?" he asked. "No," Rose said. "He slept well. The doctors seemed pleased with his condition." Richard nodded, taking a seat on the opposite side of Ethan's bed. They sat in silence, sipping their coffee, waiting for Ethan to wake up and for the day's procedures to begin. The silence was broken by a knock at the door, but instead of a doctor or nurse, a man in a dark suit entered, followed by 2 uniformed police officers. "Mr. Winters?" the man asked, looking between them. Richard stood. "Yes." The man produced a badge. "Detective Harris, Boston Police Department. We're responding to a report of financial fraud involving this child's medical treatment." Rose felt the room tilt around her. This was it. The moment she had been dreading since she pressed that transfer button. "I believe there's been a misunderstanding," Richard began, but Detective Harris cut him off. "We received a report from the hospital's financial department about a suspicious transfer of $2 million. Apparently, the payment was flagged because it came from an unusual source and was processed under unusual circumstances." He turned his gaze to Rose. "Are you Rose Thomas?" Rose stood on shaky legs. "Yes, sir. We'd like to ask you some questions about the transfer of funds from Richard Winters' account to Boston Children's Hospital 3 days ago." Before Rose could respond, Richard stepped forward. "Detective, I can explain everything. Miss Thomas was acting under my direction." Rose's head snapped up in surprise. "Your direction?" Detective Harris repeated skeptically. "Yes," Richard said firmly. "I was in Tokyo, negotiating a critical business merger. My son's condition deteriorated unexpectedly, and immediate payment was required to secure his place in this treatment program. As my household manager, Ms. Thomas has limited authority to access certain accounts in emergencies. I instructed her to make the transfer. The detective frowned. That's not what the hospital administrator told us. He said there was no authorization, that Ms. Thomas claimed to be acting independently because you couldn't be reached. That administrator spoke to me without my attorney present and misunderstood the situation, Richard said smoothly. I have emails and text messages that will verify my version of events. If you'd like to see them, you're welcome to contact my legal team. Rose stared at Richard in disbelief. He was lying to the police. For her, Detective Harris looked between them, clearly suspicious, but unwilling to press further without evidence. We'll need to see those communications, Mr. Winters. And we'll need formal statements from both of you. Of course, Richard agreed. But right now my son is about to begin a life-saving medical treatment. I'm sure you understand that our focus needs to be on him at the moment. As if on cue, Ethan stirred in the bed, his eyes fluttering open. Dad? Miss Rose? What's happening? Who are these people? The detective's expression softened at the sight of the confused child. We'll continue this discussion later, he said quietly. Mr. Winters, we'll be in touch about those statements. As the police left, Dr. Chen arrived with her team, oblivious to the tension in the room. Good morning, it's a big day, Ethan. Are we ready to get started? While the medical team prepared Ethan, explaining each step of the process, Rose pulled Richard aside. Why did you do that? She whispered. Why did you lie to them? Richard's expression was unreadable. We'll discuss it later. Right now, Ethan needs both of us to be focused on him. The first phase of the treatment took most of the day. Ethan was sedated but not fully unconscious as the medical team administered the initial doses of the gene therapy. Rose and Richard took turns sitting with him, speaking reassuring words and holding his hand through the uncomfortable parts. It was evening by the time Ethan was settled back in his room, drowsy but stable. Dr. Chen reported that everything had gone according to plan, though they wouldn't know the full effects for several days. You both should get some rest, she advised. The nurses will monitor him closely overnight, and we'll begin the second phase tomorrow afternoon. Richard nodded. Thank you, doctor. He turned to Rose. You stayed last night. I'll take tonight. There's a hotel room booked for you across the street. Get some sleep. Rose hesitated, reluctant to leave Ethan. Are you sure? Yes. Richard said firmly. We need to talk, but not here, not now. Tomorrow morning before the next treatment phase. Meet me in the hospital cafeteria at 7. Too exhausted to argue, Rose kissed Ethan's forehead, gathered her purse, and headed for the door. As she reached it, Richard called after her. Rose. She turned. Thank you, he said softly, for being here for him when I couldn't be. It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly, but it was a start. The hotel room was simple but comfortable, with a view of the hospital across the street. Rose showered for the first time in nearly 2 days, changed into clean clothes and collapsed onto the bed. Despite her exhaustion, sleep was elusive. Her mind kept replaying the scene with the police, Richard's unexpected lie, the uncertain future that still awaited her once Ethan's treatment was complete. Would Richard really press charges once they returned home? Would he fire her but keep the theft quiet? Or was his statement to the police a sign that he understood why she had done what she did? She finally drifted off to a fitful sleep, dreaming of locked doors and beeping monitors and Ethan's small voice calling for her from somewhere she couldn't reach. The next morning, Rose arrived at the hospital cafeteria precisely at 7. Richard was already there, sitting at a corner table with 2 cups of coffee and a troubled expression. He gestured for her to join him. I spoke with Ethan's doctors late last night, he said without preamble. The initial results are promising. His heart is already showing small signs of improvement. Relief washed over Rose. Thank God. Yes, Richard agreed quietly. Thank God. He pushed one of the coffee cups toward her. And thank you, Rose. That's what I brought you here to say. Rose wrapped her hands around the warm cup, not trusting herself to speak. What you did was illegal, Richard continued. It was a breach of my trust and an overstep of your authority in every possible way. He paused, his eyes meeting hers directly, and it saved my son's life. Sir, Richard held up a hand. Please let me finish. I've been thinking about this since Tokyo, about why I couldn't be reached when you needed me, about the priorities I've set in my life. He looked down at his coffee. I've been so focused on building something to leave to Ethan someday that I've missed being there for him now. And when he needed me most, I was on the other side of the world, closing a business deal. You were securing your company's future, Rose said gently. That's important too. Richard shook his head. Not as important as being there for my son. He took a deep breath. I'm not going to press charges, Rose, and I'm not going to fire you. Rose felt tears spring to her eyes. Mr. Winters, but things are going to change, he continued. For all of us, starting with how we handle this situation with the police. Rose wiped at her eyes. What do you mean? I meant what I told them yesterday. As far as anyone outside our family is concerned, you were acting under my direct authorization. I've had my legal team prepare backdated emails and texts that will support that story. The investigation will be closed quickly. Why would you do that? Rose asked, genuinely bewildered. Why risk your own reputation? Richard was quiet for a moment. Because Ethan needs you, he said finally. And because what you did, while wrong in method, was right in intent. You put my son's life above everything else, above your job, your freedom, your future. How could I punish you for that? Rose felt a weight lift from her shoulders, a burden she had been carrying since the moment she had pressed that transfer button. Thank you, she whispered. Don't thank me yet, Richard said with a hint of a smile. I said things are going to change and I meant it. He leaned forward. When we get home, we're going to have a long conversation about your role in our household and in Ethan's life. Because it's clear to me now that you're more than just our housekeeper, Rose. You're family. 3 days into Ethan's treatment, the police investigation took an unexpected turn. Detective Harris returned to the hospital, this time with a warrant and a more senior officer. They requested to speak with Richard alone, in one of the small, consultation rooms near Ethan's ward. Rose paced the hallway outside, her stomach in knots. Despite Richard's assurances, she couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to fall apart. She had broken the law, after all. No amount of backdated emails could change that fact. After 45 minutes that felt like an eternity, the door opened. The officers emerged first, their expressions grim. Detective Harris gave Rose a long, assessing look as he passed, but said nothing. Richard followed a moment later, his face pale but composed. What happened? Rose whispered, once the police were out of earshot. Richard guided her farther down the hallway away from Ethan's room. They didn't believe our story, he said quietly. The bank has surveillance footage of you accessing my account from my home computer at a time when I was verifiably in Tokyo. Rose felt her legs go weak. Oh God. It's all right, Richard said, though his tone suggested otherwise. I've called my legal team. They're on their way. They're going to arrest me, Rose said, the reality of the situation hitting her full force. Not yet, Richard assured her. I've bought us some time, but Rose, it doesn't look good. The amount is too large, the circumstances too suspicious. Even with my resources, there's a strong possibility that you'll face charges. Rose nodded, strangely calm now that the worst seemed inevitable. I understand. Just promise me one thing. What's that? Let me stay until Ethan's treatment is complete. Let me see him through this. Then I'll go with the police without a fight. Richard studied her face. You really love him, don't you? Not as an employee who cares for her employer's child, but truly love him. How could I not? Rose asked simply. I've been there for every skinned knee, every nightmare, every school project. I've watched him grow from a baby into the amazing boy he is today. Of course I love him. Richard's eyes were suspiciously bright. He loves you too, you know. More than... He broke off, looking away. More than he loves me, I sometimes think. That's not true, Rose said firmly. You're his father. He adores you. When I'm there, Richard said bitterly. Which isn't often enough. Before Rose could respond, Dr. Chen approached them, clipboard in hand. Mr. Winters? Ms. Thomas? I have Ethan's latest test results. They both turned to her, personal troubles momentarily forgotten in the face of Ethan's medical situation. The news is good, Dr. Chen said with a smile. The gene therapy is taking effect more rapidly than we anticipated. The abnormal thickening of his heart muscle has already begun to regress and his arrhythmia has almost completely resolved. Rose let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. So it's working? He's going to be okay? Based on these results, I'm cautiously optimistic, Dr. Chen said. We still need to complete the full course of treatment and he'll require monitoring for years to come. But yes, I believe Ethan is going to make a full recovery. Richard closed his eyes briefly, his relief palpable. Thank you, doctor. When can we take him home? If everything continues at this pace, I'd say within a week, Dr. Chen replied. We'll need to schedule follow-up appointments, of course, and he'll be on medication for at least 6 months. But he should be able to return to normal activities gradually. As Dr. Chen left to check on other patients, Richard turned to Rose. You hear that? He's going to be okay. Yes, Rose said, smiling despite her precarious situation. That's all that matters. They returned to Ethan's room together. He was sitting up in bed, playing a video game on a tablet that Richard had brought him. His color was better than it had been in days, and his smile when he saw them was bright. Dad. Miss Rose, Dr. Chen says I can have ice cream with dinner tonight. That's great, buddy, Richard said, ruffling his son's hair. How are you feeling? Better, Ethan said decisively. My heart's not doing the jumpy thing anymore, and I'm not as tired. That's wonderful news, Rose said, sitting on the edge of his bed. You're being so brave. Miss Rose, Ethan said, suddenly serious. When I get better, can we go to the Science Museum? Dad promised, remember? Rose glanced at Richard, unsure how to respond. By the time Ethan was well enough to visit museums, she might well be in police custody. To her surprise, Richard sat down on the other side of the bed and took his son's hand. Ethan, there's something I need to tell you, something important. Ethan's expression grew wary. Is something bad happening? No, not bad, Richard said carefully. But there might be some changes when we go home. You know how Miss Rose has taken care of you since you were a baby? Ethan nodded. Well, while you've been in the hospital, I've been thinking about how our family works, about how busy I've been with work, and how much I've missed by not being home more. Richard took a deep breath. I'm going to change that. I'm going to be home more. Spend more time with you. Really? Ethan's face lit up. That would be awesome. Really, Richard confirmed. And I'm also thinking that Miss Rose deserves a promotion. Rose looked at him sharply. This was not what she had expected. Instead of being our housekeeper, Richard continued, I think she should have a more important job. A job that matches what she really means to our family. What kind of job? Ethan asked curiously. Richard met Rose's startled gaze over Ethan's head. We'll figure that out together. The important thing is that Miss Rose will still be with us, and we'll all be together more often. How does that sound? Awesome, Ethan repeated enthusiastically. Then his brow furrowed. But wait, who will clean the house and make dinner and stuff? Richard laughed. We can hire someone else for those things. Miss Rose has more important work to do. After Ethan returned to his game, Richard gestured for Rose to step outside the room with him. What was that about? She asked once they were in the hallway. A promotion? Richard ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Rose recognized as a sign of nervousness. I've been thinking about this since our conversation in the cafeteria, about what you mean to Ethan, and what you mean to our household. And, Rose prompted when he didn't continue. And I think I've found a way to resolve this situation with the police, Richard said. But it would require a significant change in our arrangement. Before he could elaborate, they were interrupted by the arrival of two men in expensive, suits carrying leather briefcases. Richard's lawyers, Mr. Winters. The older of the two said with a nod. We need to speak with you and Ms. Thomas immediately. Richard led them to a small family waiting area that was currently empty. Once they were seated, the lawyers wasted no time getting to the point. The situation is serious. The older lawyer, who introduced himself as Mr. Davidson, began. The bank has provided conclusive evidence that Ms. Thomas accessed your accounts without authorization, and the hospital has documentation suggesting she represented herself as acting independently. The police are building a case for felony, wire fraud, and identity theft. Rose felt the room spin around her. Identity theft, wire fraud. The words sounded impossibly serious, impossibly final. What are our options? Richard asked calmly. For Ms. Thomas, limited, Mr. Davidson said bluntly. Even with the best legal defense, which I assume you're providing, she's looking at significant jail time if this goes to trial. The evidence is simply too strong. And if it doesn't go to trial? Richard pressed. The younger lawyer, Mr. Patel, spoke up. We could try to negotiate a plea deal, but given the amount involved, the prosecution would still push for some incarceration. What if the money wasn't stolen? Richard asked. What if it was a gift? Both lawyers looked at him in confusion. A gift? Mr. Davidson repeated. Yes, Richard said firmly. What if I had given Rose that money legally before she transferred it to the hospital? That would change things considerably, Mr. Patel admitted, but the timing would be problematic. The bank records clearly show. What if there were other records? Richard interrupted. Older records, showing that the money was already hers to use as she saw fit? The lawyers exchanged glances. What kind of records? Mr. Davidson asked cautiously. Marriage records, Richard said simply. Rose gasped. What? Richard turned to her, his expression deadly serious. Hear me out, Rose. If you were my wife, you would have legal access to those accounts. Any transactions you made would be considered. Joint financial decisions, the police would have no case. But we're not married, Rose pointed out, her mind reeling. We could be, Richard said. A quick civil ceremony today with paperwork dated before the transfer. My legal team can make that happen. Rose stared at him in shock. You want to commit fraud to cover up my fraud? That's your solution? It's not ideal, Richard admitted. But it's the best option we have. Mr. Winters, Mr. Davidson interjected, looking deeply uncomfortable. I feel compelled to point out that what you're suggesting would constitute multiple felonies. As your legal counsel, I cannot advise. Then step out for a moment. Richard cut him off. Give us the room. This is between Rose and me. Once the lawyers had reluctantly withdrawn, Rose turned to Richard with wide eyes. Have you lost your mind? You can't possibly be serious about this. I'm completely serious, Richard said. I won't let you go to prison for saving my son's life. But marriage, that's insane. Is it? Richard challenged. Think about it, Rose. You've lived in our home for 8 years. You've raised my son as if he were your own. You know more about my life, my habits, my preferences than anyone else on earth. In many ways, you've been more of a partner to me than an employee. That doesn't mean we should get married. Why not? Richard pressed, and give me one good reason. Rose fumbled for words. Because we're not in love. Because I work for you. Because it would be a lie. Would it? Richard asked quietly. Would it really be such a lie? Rose fell silent, unsure how to respond. I'm not saying I'm in love with you, Richard continued more gently. I'm not trying to force you into some kind of romantic relationship. But I care about you deeply, Rose. I respect you. I trust you with my son, with my home, with my life. Is that so different from the foundation of a real marriage? Yes, Rose insisted, though with less certainty. Real marriages don't start as legal maneuvers to avoid criminal charges. No. They usually start with two people who care about each other and want to build a life together, Richard countered. Which, when you think about it, is exactly what we've been doing for 8 years. Rose shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts. This is crazy. You're panicking because of the police. Maybe I am, Richard conceded. Or maybe this situation has forced me to see things more clearly than I ever have before. He took her hands in his. Rose, you're already part of our family. This would just make it official, and it would protect you from the consequences of an act that, while technically illegal, was fundamentally right. Rose pulled her hands away, standing up to pace the small room. And what happens after, when Ethan's better and we go home? Do we just get divorced, pretend it never happened? That would be your choice, Richard said. We could end it quietly once the legal danger has passed. Or what? Or we could try to make it real, Richard said softly. Not right away, not with any pressure or expectations, but maybe over time we could build something genuine from this unusual beginning. Rose stopped pacing, studying his face. There was no mockery there, no calculation, only sincerity and something else she couldn't quite name. I need time to think, she said finally. Richard nodded. I understand, but we don't have much time. The police want to interview you formally tomorrow. Once that happens, things will move quickly. Let me sit with Ethan for a while, Rose requested. Let me think. Of course, Richard agreed. I'll deal with the lawyers. Take all the time you need. Rose returned to Ethan's room, her mind in turmoil. The boy had fallen asleep, his tablet still clutched in his hand. She gently removed it, tucking the covers around him more securely, then sat in the chair beside his bed. Marriage. The word itself seemed foreign, impossible. She had given up on the idea of marriage and family long ago when she had taken on the responsibility of supporting her mother, then her sister. By the time she came to work for the Winters family, she had accepted that her life would be defined by caring for others, not by building traditional relationships of her own. And yet, hadn't she built something with Richard and Ethan? Something that in many ways resembled a family more than a typical employer-employee relationship. She cooked their meals, tended to their home, nursed them when they were ill, celebrated their triumphs and comforted them in their sorrows. She knew Richard's favorite wine and Ethan's favorite bedtime story. They knew her birthday and bought her thoughtful gifts each year. They had even taken her with them on vacations occasionally, when Richard wanted Ethan to have a familiar caretaker in strange surroundings. But marriage, to her wealthy white employer, who moved in social circles she could never hope to enter, it seemed like a plot from a soap opera, not a real solution to their problems. And yet, as she sat watching Ethan sleep, his color healthier than it had been in weeks, his breathing steady and strong, she couldn't deny the pull of Richard's suggestion. If it would keep her out of prison, if it would allow her to stay in Ethan's life. Her thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. Dr. Chen entered, carrying a tablet with Ethan's latest test results. Ms. Thomas, she greeted quietly. I didn't mean to disturb you. It's all right, Rose assured her. How is he doing? Dr. Chen smiled. Better than we expected at this stage. The treatment is working beautifully. She hesitated, then added, May I speak frankly? Rose nodded, curious. In my years of practice, I've seen many families go through medical crises like this, Dr. Chen said. I've seen how stress and fear can bring out the worst in people. But I've also seen how these situations can reveal the true strength of the bonds between people. She glanced at the sleeping Ethan. What you did to get this boy into our program was technically wrong, but morally courageous. And the way Mr. Winters has stood by you despite the legal risks, well, that speaks volumes about what you mean to this family. Rose was surprised by the doctor's insight. We have an unusual situation. Not as unusual as you might think, Dr. Chen said with a gentle smile. Families come in all shapes and forms, Ms. Thomas. What matters is the love and commitment, not the labels or legal structures. She patted Rose's shoulder as she turned to leave. Whatever you decide, I wish you all the best. Left alone with her thoughts once more, Rose watched the steady rise and fall of Ethan's chest. Dr. Chen's words echoed in her mind. Families come in all shapes and forms. What matters is the love and commitment. She thought about Richard's offer, trying to see past the shock and strangeness of it to the core of what he was suggesting. Not a romantic entanglement, not yet at least, but a formalization of the family they had already built together. A legal protection, yes, but also an acknowledgement of the bonds that had formed between them over the years. Could she do it? Could she marry a man she had never even dated, had never even thought of in romantic terms until this moment? But then, as she looked at Ethan's peaceful face, she realized she had already made her decision. For this child, she had risked prison. For this child, she would risk much more. When Richard returned an hour later, she was ready with her answer. "Yes," she said simply. "I'll do it. For Ethan." Richard's relief was palpable. "Thank you," he said, taking her hands in his. "I promise we'll make this work. Whatever happens next, we'll face it together." "Together," Rose agreed, the word feeling strange and yet right on her tongue. Richard's lawyers worked quickly, arranging for a judge who owed Richard a favor to perform a civil ceremony in the hospital's small chapel that evening. They produced backdated marriage license applications and other documentation, suggesting that Richard and Rose had been planning this step for months. The ceremony itself was brief and surreal. Rose wore her best dress, a simple navy blue sheath. She had packed for the trip to Boston, never imagining she would be married in it. Richard had his assistant bring him a fresh suit. Ethan, still weak but excited by the unexpected turn of events, served as their only witness, sitting in a wheelchair decorated with ribbons by the nurses who had grown fond of him. "By the power vested in me by the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, I now pronounce you husband and wife," the judge concluded, closing his book with a smile. "You may kiss the bride." Rose and Richard exchanged an awkward glance, neither having prepared for this moment. Finally, Richard leaned forward and placed a gentle, chaste kiss on her cheek. "We'll work on that," he whispered, and Rose couldn't help but laugh, the tension of the day finally breaking. Ethan clapped his hands. "Does this mean Miss Rose is my mom now?" The question hung in the air, loaded with implications neither adult had fully considered. "If that's what you'd like to call me," Rose said carefully, looking to Richard for guidance. "It means Rose is officially part of our family now," Richard explained to his son. "The legal word for that is stepmother, but you can call her whatever. Feels right to you?" Ethan considered this for a moment, then nodded. "I think I'll still call her Miss Rose for now, but I'm glad she's officially family. I always thought she was anyway." "So did I, buddy," Richard said softly. "So did I." The next morning, Detective Harris and his senior colleague returned to the hospital. Richard met them with his lawyers, presenting the marriage certificate and backdated documents. "As you can see," Mr. Davidson explained smoothly, "Mrs. Winters was acting within her legal rights as Mr. Winters' wife when she transferred funds from their joint account to pay for their son's treatment. The police were skeptical but had to acknowledge that the documentation appeared to be in order." The senior officer took Richard aside. "Off the record, Mr. Winters, we both know this marriage is awfully convenient in its timing." Richard met his gaze steadily. "My wife and I have been together for 8 years, officer. She has raised my son alongside me. The only thing new is the piece of paper that makes it official." After a long moment, the officer nodded. "I see. Well, in light of this new information, we'll have to reconsider the investigation. Don't leave town until we've made a final determination." As the police left, Rose approached Richard, who was standing by the window in Ethan's room, looking out at the Boston skyline. "Do you think they believed it?" she asked quietly. "I think they believe enough of it to drop the case," Richard replied. "And that's what matters." Rose nodded, relief washing over her. "So what happens now?" Richard turned to face her, his expression thoughtful. "Now we focus on getting Ethan well and taking him home after that." He shrugged. "After that, we figure out what this new arrangement means for all of us. Day by day." "Day by day," Rose echoed, the phrase somehow comforting in its simplicity. From his bed, Ethan called out to them, "Dad, Miss Rose, can we watch a movie together?" They turned to him simultaneously, both smiling at his enthusiasm. "Of course we can," Rose said, moving to sit beside him. "What would you like to watch?" Richard asked, joining them on the other side of the bed. As Ethan debated the merits of various superhero films, Rose caught Richard's eye over the boy's head. He gave her a small, tentative smile. Not the smile of a man who had just executed a clever legal maneuver, but the smile of a man embarking on an unexpected journey with equal parts hope and uncertainty. Rose returned the smile, her own feelings just as complex. What they had done was unconventional, perhaps even reckless. But as Ethan snuggled between them, remote control in hand, she couldn't help feeling that somehow, against all odds, they had found their way to where they were always meant to be, together. A family. 6 months after the life-changing events in Boston, Rose stood in the large bay window of the Winters estate, watching as Richard and Ethan played catch on the sprawling lawn. Ethan moved with the boundless energy of a healthy child, running and laughing as if he had never been ill. His medical team had cleared him for all normal activities just 2 weeks ago, declaring the gene therapy a complete success. So much had changed since that desperate day, when Rose had made the decision that altered all their lives. The mansion was the same, with its soaring ceilings and priceless artwork, but the energy within its walls had transformed completely. For one thing, Richard was home most days by 6, having restructured his company to allow him more family time. He had delegated many of his day-to-day responsibilities to trusted executives, focusing his own efforts on long-term strategy and innovation, work he could often do from his home office. And then there was Rose's new position in the household. No longer a housekeeper, she now managed the entire estate and oversaw the small staff they had hired to handle the cooking and cleaning she used to do herself. But more significantly, she was navigating her new role as Richard's wife, a position that had begun as a legal maneuver but had gradually evolved into something neither of them had anticipated. They had separate bedrooms, an arrangement they had agreed upon from the start. Their marriage certificate might be legal, but they were determined to build their relationship naturally, without forcing intimacy that neither was ready for. Yet Rose couldn't deny the subtle shift in her feelings for Richard over the past months. She had always respected him as an employer, had always cared for him as Ethan's father, but now she found herself noticing things she had previously overlooked. The gentle way he explained difficult concepts to Ethan, the quiet strength he showed during challenging business calls, the surprising sense of humor that emerged when he was truly relaxed. The sound of the doorbell pulled Rose from her thoughts. She smoothed her simple blue dress, no longer a uniform but still practical and modest, and went to answer it. Their new housekeeper had the day off, and Rose still found it strange to sit idle when there were tasks to be done. On the doorstep stood Vanessa Harrington, the wife of one of Richard's business associates and a prominent figure in their affluent community. Rose had met her several times at company functions when she had attended as staff, always blending into the background, invisible to women like Vanessa. "Rose, darling," Vanessa exclaimed with practiced warmth, air-kissing near Rose's cheeks. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything. I was just in the neighborhood and thought I'd drop by to finalize the details for the Children's Hospital fundraiser." "Of course," Rose said, stepping back to let her enter. "Richard and Ethan are in the backyard. Would you like some tea?" "That would be lovely," Vanessa replied, following Rose to the sunroom that overlooked the garden. As Rose prepared the tea tray, old habits died hard. She could feel Vanessa's eyes on her, evaluating, assessing. "You know," Vanessa said conversationally, "when I first heard that Richard had married his housekeeper, I was shocked. We all were, honestly. It seemed so sudden." Rose kept her expression neutral as she placed a delicate china cup in front of Vanessa. "I imagine it did. But then," Vanessa continued, stirring a spoonful of sugar into her tea, "we heard about what you did for Ethan, taking matters into your own hands when Richard was unreachable, securing that experimental treatment that saved his life." She took a sip of tea, her eyes never leaving Rose's face. "That's when it all made sense." "What made sense?" Rose asked carefully. Why Richard fell in love with you, of course, Vanessa said as if it were obvious. A woman who would risk everything for his child? That's the kind of loyalty money can't buy. Rose felt heat rise in her cheeks. The story of their relationship had been carefully crafted and shared among Richard's social circle, presenting their marriage as the natural culmination of years of quiet devotion rather than a hasty legal maneuver to avoid criminal charges. It was strange to hear it reflected back to her now as if it were the simple truth. Richard and I have known each other for a long time, she said diplomatically. We've been through a lot together. And now look at you, Vanessa said with a wave of her hand. From housekeeper to lady of the manor. It's like a fairy tale. Before Rose could respond, the French doors opened and Richard entered, flushed from playing outside with Ethan. Vanessa, what a nice surprise, he said, crossing the room to kiss her cheek. Then he moved to Rose's side, placing a casual hand on her shoulder, a gesture that still felt new and startling every time. I see my wife is taking good care of you. The word wife sent a small shiver through Rose as it always did. 6 months of marriage, and she still wasn't used to hearing Richard refer to her that way. She certainly is, Vanessa agreed. We were just discussing the fundraiser for the children's hospital. Ah, yes, Richard said, sitting down beside Rose. It's coming together nicely? Almost everything is arranged, Vanessa confirmed. We just need to finalize the guest list. And of course, everyone is dying to hear you speak about the foundation. The foundation had been Richard's idea, born in those intense days at the Boston hospital. The Ethan Winters Foundation for Pediatric Cardiac Research now funded access to experimental treatments for children whose families couldn't afford them, along with supporting research into gene therapies for rare heart conditions. Richard had seeded it with $20 million of his own money, and corporate donations had nearly doubled that amount in the 6 months since its launch. I'd be happy to say a few words, Richard agreed. Though I think Rose should speak as well. The foundation was as much her inspiration as mine. Vanessa looked surprised. Oh, well, that would be unusual, but I suppose quite touching. The Cinderella story and all that. Rose felt Richard's body tense beside her. Rose is the executive director of the foundation, Vanessa, he said, his voice pleasant but firm. She has degrees in business administration and healthcare management that she completed through online programs while working for our family. Her background gives her unique insight into both the practical and emotional aspects of what these families are facing. Vanessa had the grace to look embarrassed. Of course, I didn't mean to imply. That is, I'm sure Rose will do wonderfully. After Vanessa left with the fundraiser details settled, Richard found Rose in the kitchen, absent-mindedly arranging flowers in a vase. I'm sorry about Vanessa, he said, leaning against the counter. Some people can't see beyond the narrative they've created in their minds. Rose smiled faintly. It's all right. She's not entirely wrong, is she? Our story is unusual. Unusual, yes, Richard agreed. But not the way she thinks. He hesitated, then asked, Does it bother you? The way people see us? Rose considered the question carefully. Sometimes, she admitted. Not because I care what they think, but because it reminds me how this all began. The lie at the foundation of our marriage. Richard moved closer, gently turning her to face him. Is it still a lie, Rose, after these past 6 months? The question hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken feelings. Before she could answer, Ethan burst into the kitchen, sweaty and grinning. Dad said we can go for ice cream if you come too, he announced. Can we go now, please? The moment broken, Rose smiled at the boy who had become, in every way that mattered, her son. Of course we can. Go wash up first. As Ethan thundered up the stairs, Richard touched Rose's arm lightly. We'll continue this conversation later? She nodded, a mixture of anticipation and nervousness fluttering in her stomach. Later that evening, after Ethan was tucked in bed, Rose found Richard in his study, working on his speech for the fundraiser. She knocked softly on the open door and he immediately set aside his laptop, gesturing for her to come in. I've been thinking about your question, she said. settling into the leather chair across from his desk. About whether our marriage is still a lie. Richard waited, giving her space to gather her thoughts. When we first did this, Rose began slowly, it was purely practical, a solution to a legal problem. And I was prepared to quietly divorce once the danger had passed. I remember, Richard said quietly. But then something strange happened, Rose continued. As we settled into this new arrangement, as we worked together for Ethan, for the foundation, I started to feel like we were building something real, something that might have happened naturally if circumstances had been different. Richard's eyes never left her face. And now? Rose took a deep breath. Now I find myself wondering what would have happened if we'd met as equals. If I hadn't been your employee for 8 years. If we'd just been two people who connected over our love for a child and a desire to make the world better. We can't change how we met, Richard said, but we can decide where we go from here. He stood and moved around the desk, kneeling in front of her chair so they were at eye level. Rose, when I suggested this marriage, it was out of desperation. I couldn't bear the thought of you going to prison for saving Ethan. But these past 6 months have shown me what was right in front of me all along. A brilliant, compassionate, strong woman who makes my life better in every way. Rose felt tears prick her eyes. Richard, let me finish, he said gently. I'm not saying I'm madly in love. I think we're both too practical for that kind of sudden declaration. But I care deeply for you, Rose. I respect you. I enjoy your company. And I think, if you're willing, we could see where this goes. Not as employer and employee pretending to be married, but as two people building a life together. Honestly, openly. What about Ethan? Rose asked, thinking of the boy who had been at the center of all their choices. Ethan already loves you, Richard said simply. He has since he was a baby. Whether we're married or not, you're part of his family. Rose reached out, hesitantly touching Richard's face. He leaned into her touch, his eyes closing briefly. I'd like to try, she whispered. For real this time. The next morning, the Winters family made headlines again, but not in the society pages. Richard had called a press conference to announce a major new initiative of the Ethan Winters Foundation, a $50 million commitment to expand access to gene therapy treatments to children in underserved communities across the country. Standing at the podium with Richard on one side and Ethan on the other, Rose addressed the crowd of reporters with confidence and passion. She spoke about healthcare disparities, about families making impossible choices, about children whose lives hung in the balance due to financial barriers. No parent should have to choose between saving their child and obeying the law, she said, her voice steady. No family should face financial ruin because their child was born with a rare condition. And no child should die because a life-saving treatment was available but unaffordable. As she spoke, she felt Richard's hand find hers, their fingers intertwining in a gesture that felt both supportive and intimate. The photographers captured the moment. The former housekeeper turned foundation director, her husband the billionaire, and the child they both loved standing together in perfect unity. Later, as they left the press conference, a young reporter approached Rose. Mrs. Winters, your story has inspired so many people. A housekeeper who risked everything to save her employer's son and ended up finding love and creating a foundation that will help countless children. What would you say to others in impossible situations? Rose paused, considering the question. Carefully, the official story of their relationship had taken on a life of its own, becoming a modern fairy tale that inspired magazine features and social media posts. The truth, the desperate theft, the legal maneuvering, the pragmatic marriage to avoid prosecution, was known only to them and a handful of others. Yet standing there with Richard's arm around her waist and Ethan's hand in hers, Rose realized that sometimes the simplified story captured a deeper truth. She had taken an impossible risk out of love for a child who wasn't hers by birth. That risk had led to a profound transformation in all their lives. And while their path had been unconventional, the family they had created was genuine. I would say that love demands courage, she answered finally. and that sometimes when you're willing to risk everything for someone else's well-being, you end up finding exactly where you belong. As they walked to their waiting car, Richard leaned close to her ear. "That was a perfect answer," he murmured. "Absolutely true, yet discreet." Rose smiled. "Some stories are too complicated for sound bites. Ours is one of them." "Speaking of our story," Richard said as they settled into the back seat, Ethan already absorbed in a game on his tablet. "I was thinking we might take a real honeymoon this summer. The three of us. Perhaps that trip to Europe Ethan's been asking about." "A honeymoon 6 months after the wedding?" Rose teased. "Well, we did things a bit out of order," Richard replied with a smile. "But I'd like to get them right from here on out." That night, for the first time since their hasty courthouse wedding, Richard and Rose shared a room. Not with the passion of new lovers, but with the comfortable intimacy of two people who had known each other deeply for years and were finally allowing themselves to acknowledge the connection that had grown between them. As they lay talking in the darkness, Rose found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this point. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked quietly. "Marrying me to keep me out of prison?" Richard propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at her in the dim light. "Never," he said firmly. "It may have begun as a desperate solution, but it led us exactly where we were meant to be." "And where is that?" Rose whispered. "Together," Richard said simply. "A family." 1 year to the day after Rose had made the desperate decision to transfer those life-saving funds, the three of them stood in the newly completed Ethan Winters Pediatric Cardiac Center at Boston Children's Hospital. The state-of-the-art facility would provide gene therapy treatments to children regardless of their family's ability to pay, funded in perpetuity by the foundation that bore Ethan's name. Dr. Chen, now the center's director, led them on a tour of the gleaming treatment rooms and comfortable family areas. "You've created something remarkable here," she told them as they stood in the central atrium, where a wall of windows flooded the space with natural light. "From one child's treatment, you've built a legacy that will save thousands." "It was Rose who started it all," Richard said, his arm around his wife's shoulders. "Her courage changed everything." "Sometimes the most important decisions are the hardest ones," Dr. Chen observed. "The ones that force us to choose between what is legal and what is right." She glanced at the wedding ring on Rose's finger, a knowing look in her eyes, and sometimes those impossible choices lead to the most beautiful outcomes. As they prepared to leave, a young mother approached them, her daughter in a wheelchair beside her. The girl couldn't have been more than 7, with bright eyes and a feeding tube visible beneath her colorful dress. "I'm sorry to bother you," the woman said hesitantly. "But I recognized you from the news. I wanted to thank you personally. My daughter Lily starts her treatment here next week. Without your foundation—" She trailed off, her eyes filling with tears. "We'd tried everything. Sold our house, maxed out our credit cards, started a GoFundMe that barely made a dent. We were out of options." Rose knelt down to the little girl's level. "Hello, Lily. Are you excited about your treatment?" The child nodded shyly. "The doctor said it might make my heart strong enough so I can play soccer again." "I bet it will," Rose said with a smile. "My son Ethan had the same treatment, and now he plays all the sports he wants." As she spoke, she felt Richard's hand on her shoulder, a gentle pressure of solidarity and love. "My son Ethan, not my husband's son, or the boy I care for. Simply, truthfully, her son." The mother noticed the gesture, her eyes moving between Richard and Rose. "You give me hope," she said quietly. "Not just for Lily's treatment, but for afterwards, for a normal life." As they walked out of the hospital into the bright sunshine, Ethan ran ahead, testing the limits of his healthy heart with each exuberant step. Richard took Rose's hand, lifting it to his lips in a gesture that had become familiar and cherished. "Happy anniversary," he said softly. "Anniversary?" Rose repeated, confused. "Our wedding was in February." Richard smiled. I'm not talking about our legal wedding. I'm talking about the day you made the bravest decision of your life. The day you risked everything to save our son. The day our real story began. Rose felt tears prick her eyes as the truth of his words washed over her. Their journey had begun with a desperate act, a criminal transferring of funds across digital wires. But it had blossomed into something neither of them could have imagined, a marriage of equals built on respect and growing love, a family bonded by choice rather than obligation, and a foundation that would change countless lives. It wasn't the way I expected our lives to turn out, she admitted, watching Ethan race up and down the hospital steps, strong and healthy and full of promise. The best stories rarely follow the expected path, Richard said, drawing her close. But they end up exactly where they're supposed to be. As they walked toward their waiting car, a family united by unusual circumstances but bound by genuine love, Rose reflected on the strange and wonderful truth. Sometimes the greatest risks lead to the most profound rewards. And sometimes what begins as a desperate act of theft can transform, through love and commitment, into the most precious gift of all, a family, whole and complete, and exactly as it was always meant to be.